The rain came down so hard that it stung her skin, but Evelina Hartwell did not move. She stood on the stone steps of Ashcombe Manor, her silk dress already ruined, her hands pressed together to keep them from shaking. Behind the tall oak doors, she could still hear the laughter of the guests, the clink of glasses, the low rumble of male voices discussing trade routes and land disputes, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a woman had not just been thrown out into a storm like a piece of broken furniture. Only minutes earlier, she had been standing beside her husband, Julian Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe, greeting Lord Callum Whitmore and his party. She had made a comment, an innocent one in her mind, about the price of imported silk from the eastern ports. She had not known that Lord Whitmore had lost a fortune in a failed silk venture the year before. She had not known, because no one had told her, because in this world of dukes and lords, a woman was expected to know things without ever being taught them. Julian's face had gone pale, then red, then a terrible, controlled white. He had not shouted, that was the worst part. He had simply turned to her, his voice low and even, and said the words that now echoed through her mind like a struck bell. Get out. Stand outside until you learn what it means to hold your tongue. She had thought at first that he was jesting. Dukes did not send their wives out into storms, but the housemaster, Griggs, would not meet her eyes as he opened the side door for her, and the last thing she saw before the door closed was Julian's back, straight and unmoving, walking toward his guests, as though he had merely stepped out to check on the weather. Now the weather was all there was. The rain fell from a sky the color of wet ash, and the wind pulled at her hair, tearing it from its careful pins, until it hung in dark, heavy ropes down her back. She could see her breath in short white clouds. Her feet, in thin slippers meant for dancing, and not for standing on cold stone, had gone numb sometime in the last hour, though she could not say exactly when, because the pain had blurred into something else, something duller and more constant. She thought of her mother, back in the merchant quarter of the city, a woman who had built a small fortune from nothing, buying and selling cloth and spices, with a sharpness that made men twice her size step aside. Her mother would never have stood for this. Her mother would have marched back through those doors and reminded every lord in that room exactly whose money had built half their carriages. But Evelina was not her mother. She had been raised gently, in comfort, protected by her mother's hard work from ever having to fight the way her mother had fought. And now, standing in the rain, with her arms wrapped around herself, she understood for the first time just how little that comfort had prepared her for a husband who saw her as something to be corrected rather than someone to be heard. A voice called out from one of the upper windows. It was Nora, her young maid, leaning out despite the rain soaking her sleeves. "My lady, please, come to the side gate. I'll let you in through the kitchen. No one will know." Evelina looked up at her, at the girl's frightened, earnest face, and shook her head. "No, Nora. Go back inside before you catch a chill." "But my lady," the Duke said. "I know what he said." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "If I go inside now, through some hidden door, then nothing will have changed. He will simply do it again the next time I displease him, and the time after that. I would rather stand here all night than teach him that his cruelty works." Nora's face crumpled, but she withdrew from the window, and a moment later, Evelina saw a shadow move behind the glass, likely the girl weeping, where she thought no one could see. The rain did not let up. If anything, it grew heavier, drumming against the stone terrace, running in small rivers along the cracks between the paving stones, and soaking into the hem of her dress until the fabric clung to her legs like a second, colder skin. She began to shiver in earnest now, her teeth chattering despite her best efforts to keep her jaw locked tight. She thought about the wedding, 6 months ago. Julian had seemed different then, or perhaps she had simply chosen not to see the parts of him that frightened her. He had been attentive at first, walking with her through the gardens, asking about her family's business, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She remembered thinking that perhaps a marriage arranged for money and title could still grow into something warmer, given time and patience. But patience, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as blindness. There had been small signs before tonight. The way he corrected her in front of servants when she used the wrong fork. The way he had once refused to speak to her for 2 full days after she had laughed too loudly at a dinner party. The way his mother, the old Duchess, now living in the West Wing, had once warned her, in a voice like dry leaves, that Julian did not forgive mistakes easily, and that the sooner Evelina learned this, the easier her life would be. She had wanted to believe that love, or at least respect, could be built between two people who had been thrown together by contracts and land agreements. Standing in the rain, soaked through and shaking, she began to understand that respect was not something Julian intended to give her. It was something he intended to demand. The hours passed slowly. She lost track of how many times the great clock in the hall struck behind the walls, its low chimes muffled by stone and rain. At some point, she noticed that her hands had stopped shaking, not because she had grown warmer, but because she had grown numb enough that her body no longer registered the cold as pain. She knew, somewhere in the rational part of her mind, that this was not a good sign. But the rational part of her mind felt very far away, as though it belonged to someone else. Someone standing behind glass, watching her from a safe distance. She thought of Julian, riding out to his meeting with Lord Whitmore, a meeting he had arranged weeks in advance to discuss a shared shipping venture along the northern coast. She imagined him climbing into his carriage, without so much as a glance back at the manor, confident that by the time he returned, she would have slipped inside, humbled and quiet, ready to apologize for her thoughtless words. She wondered if he pictured her crying in her room, chastised and small, learning her lesson exactly as he intended. She would not give him that. Even as her body grew colder, even as her vision began to blur at the edges, some stubborn ember inside her refused to be extinguished. She would stand here, in the rain, for as long as it took, not because she believed it would change anything, but because moving would mean admitting that he was right to treat her this way. And she did not believe that. She would never believe that. A carriage rattled somewhere in the distance, wheels grinding against wet gravel, and for a moment her heart lifted, thinking perhaps someone from the village had noticed her and sent for help. But the sound faded, moving away from the manor rather than toward it, and she was alone again, with the rain and the wind and the slow, creeping cold that had begun to settle into her bones like something permanent. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to rest them, and when she opened them again, the world seemed to tilt slightly, the dark shape of the manor swaying against the darker sky. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall beside her, steadying herself, forcing her mind to stay present, to stay aware. She would not fall. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of finding her collapsed on the ground like a wilted flower. Inside the manor, though she could not see it, the dinner was ending. Guests were calling for their carriages, wrapping themselves in furs and cloaks against the storm, exchanging final pleasantries with a host who smiled and nodded, and gave no sign that his wife was standing outside in the same rain that was making his guests hurry to their carriages. Julian shook hands, laughed at a joke someone made about the terrible weather, and did not once think to ask whether his wife had been let back inside. He had, in his mind, already resolved the matter. She had embarrassed him in front of men whose opinions mattered to his business and his reputation. He had corrected her, in the way his own father had once corrected his mother, in the way that had been considered proper and necessary in the households he had grown up in. He believed, with the same unquestioning certainty that had shaped his entire upbringing, that a lesson delivered harshly was still a lesson, and that Evelina would emerge from this night wiser and more careful with her words. He climbed into his own carriage not long after his guests departed, heading toward Lord Whitmore's estate for their late meeting, one that could not be postponed given the tight timeline of their shipping venture. As the carriage rolled away from Ashcombe Manor, he glanced back once, out of habit rather than concern, and saw only the dark outline of the building against the storm-heavy sky. He did not see Evelina, because she was pressed close against the wall, out of his line of sight, and even if she had been visible, the rain and the darkness would have hidden her from him entirely. He settled back into his seat, closed his eyes, and thought instead about silk prices and shipping contracts, about the delicate negotiations ahead, with a man still bitter over old losses. His wife, for the moment, had ceased to occupy any space in his thoughts at all. Back at the manor, Evelina's knees had begun to weaken. She locked them, the way she had been taught to do during long church services as a girl, forcing her body to remain upright through sheer stubborn will. Her lips had gone from pale to a faint shade of blue, though she could not see this herself, and her breathing had grown shallow, quick and shivering, each breath catching slightly before releasing. Somewhere behind the manor's thick walls, the housekeeper, Margaret, stood at a window with her hands pressed to the glass, watching the small, unmoving shape of the Duchess in the rain. She had served this family for over 30 years, had raised the current Duke from infancy, had watched him grow from a gentle boy into a hard, guarded man. She had never once seen him treat a person this way, not even the servants who had made far graver errors than a careless comment about silk. Margaret's hands trembled against the cold glass. Every instinct told her to run down the stairs, throw open the door, and pull the young Duchess inside, before the storm did something the Duke would never be able to undo. But orders were orders in this house, and Margaret had learned long ago what happened to servants who defied the Duke's word, even with the kindest of intentions. She stood there for a long moment, torn between duty and conscience, watching the rain fall harder, watching the young woman below sway slightly on her feet before steadying herself once more. Finally, Margaret made a decision that would matter more than she yet understood. She turned from the window and hurried toward the servants' quarters, her old joints protesting with every step, determined to find some way to help without breaking the letter of the Duke's command, even if she could not yet see exactly how. Outside, Evelina remained standing, alone, cold, and utterly unaware that inside the walls she stared at, someone had finally begun to move on her behalf. Margaret moved through the servants' corridor with a speed that surprised even herself, her candle throwing long shadows against the stone walls as she searched for someone, anyone, who might help her find a way around the Duke's cruel order without directly disobeying it. She found the young footman, Peter, polishing boots near the kitchen entrance, his face drawn with the same worry that had been passing quietly among the staff all evening. "Peter," she said, keeping her voice low, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Fetch a blanket from the linen room. A heavy one, the wool kind we use in the winter months." Peter looked up, understanding immediately what she intended. "The Duke said no one was to let her inside, Mrs. Margaret." "I did not say anything about letting her inside," Margaret replied, her jaw tight. "I said fetch a blanket. What is done with it afterward is a matter I will decide." Peter did not argue further. He disappeared down the corridor, returning minutes later with a thick woolen blanket folded over his arm. Margaret took it from him and wrapped it carefully beneath her own cloak, shielding it from the worst of the rain as she made her way to a side door that led out near the terrace where Evelina stood. When she opened the door, the storm rushed in with a force that nearly knocked the candle from her hand. She shielded the flame with her palm and stepped out into the night, moving quickly toward the small, still figure by the wall. "My lady," Margaret called softly, not wanting to startle her. "It is only me, Margaret." Evelina turned her head slowly, as though the motion cost her great effort. Her eyes, when they found Margaret's face, seemed distant and unfocused, though a flicker of recognition passed through them. "Margaret," she said, her voice thin and trembling, "you should not be out here." "The Duke gave no instruction about blankets," Margaret said firmly, already draping the heavy wool over Evelina's shivering shoulders. "And I have served this family long enough to know the difference between following an order and abandoning a person to die of cold." Evelina's fingers, stiff and nearly useless from the chill, tried weakly to pull the blanket closer around herself. Margaret helped her, tucking the edges in with the same practiced care she had once used to bundle the young Julian against winter drafts when he was still a small boy afraid of thunderstorms. "You must go back inside, Margaret," Evelina whispered. "If he learns you defied him." "Let him learn," Margaret said, though her voice wavered slightly at the thought. "I have watched that boy grow from a child who cried when his puppy went missing, into a man who leaves his wife standing in a storm. I do not know what happened to him in between, but I will not stand by and watch you suffer for it without doing what small thing I can." For a moment, something like gratitude broke through the numbness on Evelina's face, though it was quickly swallowed again by the deep, bone-aching cold that had settled into her. "Will you not come inside, my lady, just to the kitchen, where no guest would see, where the Duke need never know?" "No," Evelina said, and though her voice was weak, there was an iron thread running through it that Margaret recognized, the same thread she had heard in the voices of certain strong women throughout her long years of service. "If I go inside now, in secret, then I will have learned exactly what he wanted me to learn, that his anger is something to be avoided rather than answered. I will not give him that victory, even if no one else ever knows the difference." Margaret studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from the edge of her own hood, and then nodded slowly, understanding something about this young woman that she had not fully grasped before this night. Then I will bring more blankets, she said, and something warm to drink, if I can manage it without drawing attention. You may refuse to come inside, my lady, but I will not stand by and do nothing while you stand out here. She left then, hurrying back through the side door, already planning her next small act of quiet defiance. Inside, the manor had grown quieter, as the last of the dinner guests departed into the storm, their carriages rattling away down the long gravel drive toward the main road. The remaining staff moved through the halls, extinguishing candles and clearing away the remnants of the evening's feast, though many of them cast worried glances toward the windows facing the terrace, unable to fully ignore what they knew was happening just beyond the glass. In the west wing of the manor, the old Duchess, Julian's mother, sat by her fire with a book open on her lap that she had not read a single word of in the past hour. She had heard, through one of her own maids, exactly what her son had done, and the news had settled into her chest with a familiar, heavy weight. She rose from her chair slowly, her joints aching with age, and made her way to her window, which faced a different angle of the terrace than Margaret's had. From this distance, she could just make out the pale shape of Evelina against the dark stone, wrapped now in something that had not been there before. The old Duchess closed her eyes briefly, remembering her own younger years in this same house, remembering a night not so different from this one, when she herself had stood in a similar storm, sent out by Julian's father for some equally small and forgettable offense. She remembered the cold, the way it had seeped into every joint and never quite left her, the way her own mother-in-law at the time had watched from a window much like this one and done nothing at all. She had promised herself, decades ago, that if she ever had the power to prevent such a thing from happening to another woman in this family, she would not remain silent as her own mother-in-law had. Turning from the window, she called for her personal maid, a quiet, loyal woman named Dahlia who had served her for nearly 20 years. Dahlia, she said, her voice carrying the particular authority that only she, as the previous Duchess, still held within these walls. I want you to go to Mrs. Margaret and tell her that I give my permission, as the Duchess Dowager of this house, for anything necessary to be done to protect the current Duchess's health and safety. Whatever occurs, Julian's anger will fall on me, not on the staff. Dahlia's eyes widened slightly at the boldness of this instruction, but she did not hesitate. Yes, my lady, at once. As Dahlia hurried off to deliver the message, the old Duchess returned to her window, watching the small, huddled shape on the terrace below, with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her age, and everything to do with memory. Meanwhile, outside, Evelina remained standing, the blanket around her shoulders, offering some small relief from the wind, though the cold rain still found its way through every gap and seam, soaking steadily into the wool, and chilling her further despite Margaret's efforts. Her mind had begun to drift in strange directions, memories surfacing and dissolving with no particular order. She thought of her father, who had died when she was 12, and the way he used to carry her on his shoulders through the market stalls, calling out prices in a booming, cheerful voice that drew customers from every direction. She thought of her mother's hands, rough and capable, counting coins by candlelight late into the night, building the fortune that had eventually made Evelina an attractive match for a duke in need of funds to repair his family's aging estates. She wondered, distantly, whether her mother had known what kind of household she was sending her daughter into, or whether the promise of a title had blinded even her sharp, practical mind to the dangers hidden behind Julian's polished manners. A sound at the side door pulled her back to the present. Margaret had returned, this time with a second blanket and a small flask that she pressed into Evelina's stiff hands. Warm broth, my lady. Just a little. It will help. Evelina's fingers fumbled with the flask's lid, too numb to manage the simple task, and Margaret gently took it back, opening it herself and holding it to Evelina's lips so she could drink without having to grip anything. The warmth of the broth spread through her chest, a small mercy against the relentless cold, though it did little to stop the deep shivering that had become almost constant now, her whole body trembling in a rhythm she could no longer control. The Dowager Duchess sends her word, Margaret said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as though the old Duke's ghost himself might overhear. She says any protection given to you tonight will fall under her authority, not the staff's. You are not alone in this house, my lady, whatever it might feel like standing out here. Evelina managed a small, trembling smile, though it did not fully reach her eyes, which had grown glassy and distant with the cold. Tell her I am grateful. Tell her. She paused, swaying slightly, before catching herself against the wall. Tell her I understand now. Something I did not understand before tonight. Margaret frowned with concern, noting the strange, faraway quality in the young woman's voice, the slight slur beginning to creep into her words. She had seen this before, in villagers caught out in winter storms, this dangerous drift toward a calm that was not calm at all, but something far more serious. My lady, please, I beg you to reconsider. Come inside, just for a moment, just to warm yourself by the kitchen fire. No, Evelina said again, though the word came out softer this time, less certain, as though even her stubbornness was beginning to fray at the edges under the weight of the cold. I will stand. I said I would stand, and I will. Margaret stayed beside her as long as she dared, murmuring soft reassurances, adjusting the blankets, watching the storm show no sign of weakening. But eventually, duty called her back inside to attend to other tasks, and she left, with a heavy heart, uncertain whether the small comforts she had provided would be enough to see the young Duchess safely through what remained of this terrible night. Evelina stood alone once more, the blankets heavy and soaked around her shoulders, her body trembling in the dark, while somewhere across the county, her husband sat in a warm, well-lit study, discussing shipping contracts with a man he had once considered an enemy, utterly unaware of the slow, dangerous unraveling taking place back at his own home. Lord Callum Whitmore's study smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, the walls lined with maps of shipping routes that stretched from the northern coast down through foreign ports Julian had spent years trying to secure trade rights with. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the papers spread between the two men, contracts and figures that represented months of careful, patient negotiation. Julian sat with his usual composed posture, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other tracing figures on a ledger sheet, as Callum spoke about tariffs and delivery schedules. Outside, the storm rattled against the windows, but here, in this warm room, it felt distant and unimportant, a minor inconvenience rather than anything worth his attention. Your numbers on the eastern route seem optimistic, Callum said, leaning back in his chair, studying Julian with the careful, assessing look of a man who had lost money before and did not intend to lose it again. What guarantee do I have that this venture will not end the way the silk deal did? Julian met his gaze steadily. You have my word, and you have the fact that I would not risk my own family's finances on a venture I did not believe in. My estates need this partnership as much as yours does, perhaps more. Callum studied him a moment longer before nodding slowly, seemingly satisfied by the honesty in Julian's answer. Your wife mentioned the silk prices tonight. I confess it stung more than I let show. But I do not hold grudges against a woman for speaking without knowing the full history of a matter. Something in Julian's chest tightened at the mention of Evelina, a brief flicker of the anger he had carried out of his own dining room hours earlier. She spoke without thinking. It will not happen again. Callum raised an eyebrow slightly at the sharpness in Julian's tone, but said nothing further on the matter, instead returning to the papers between them. The two men continued their discussion for another hour, working through the finer details of the shipping arrangement, the storm outside growing louder as the night deepened. At one point, a servant entered with fresh tea, and Callum asked idly, Will your Duchess be attending the harvest gathering next month? My own wife has been eager to make her better acquaintance, Julian answered smoothly, without hesitation, already composing in his mind the image he intended to present. Of course, she is only newly accustomed to matters of estate business. She will learn quickly enough what is expected of her. He said this with the easy confidence of a man discussing the training of a young horse, not the well-being of the woman he had married. And if Callum noticed anything troubling in his tone, he chose not to comment on it, perhaps out of the same instinct that kept most men from questioning how another managed his own household. As the negotiations drew toward their conclusion, the two men shook hands over the final terms, and Julian rose to take his leave, the late hour finally catching up with him in the form of a dull ache behind his eyes. He thanked Callum for his hospitality, accepted a final glass of brandy before departing, and made his way out to his waiting carriage, through a storm that had, if anything, grown more violent in the hours since his arrival. The carriage ride back to Ashcombe Manor was long and rough, the wheels struggling against roads turned to mud by the relentless rain. Julian leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the dark countryside blur past in flashes of lightning, his mind still turning over the details of the shipping contract, calculating profits and risks, with the same careful attention he gave to everything in his life, except, it seemed, the people closest to him. He thought briefly of Evelina, imagining her curled in their bedchamber, perhaps still tearful from the evening's events, perhaps already asleep, exhausted from her ordeal. He pictured himself entering quietly, finding her contrite and subdued, and felt a small satisfaction at the thought, a confirmation that his methods, however harsh they might seem to softer minds, produced the results his own upbringing had taught him to expect. His father had never apologized for such lessons. Not once in all the years Julian had watched him discipline both servants and family members alike with the same cold, controlled authority. His father's marriage to his mother had lasted 40 years, a fact Julian had always taken as proof that such methods, however uncomfortable in the moment, ultimately built strong and lasting households. He had never once considered that his mother's silence over those 40 years might have been born of exhaustion rather than contentment, of resignation rather than respect. The carriage jolted hard over a rut in the road, nearly throwing Julian from his seat, and he cursed the driver under his breath before settling back again, his thoughts returning to business matters, to the ledgers waiting for him in his study, to the dozen small tasks that would demand his attention come morning. Not once, in the entire hour-long journey home, did it occur to him to wonder whether Evelina had actually been allowed back inside the manor at all. As the carriage finally turned up the long gravel drive toward Ashcombe Manor, Julian noticed, through the rain-streaked window, that most of the house's windows had gone dark, the servants having retired for the night. Only a few candles still burned, faint and flickering, in rooms he recognized as the kitchen and, curiously, in his mother's chambers in the west wing, though he thought little of this at the time. The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, and Julian stepped down into the rain, pulling his cloak tighter against the wind, as he hurried toward the front doors. He did not glance toward the terrace, the memory of Evelina's punishment already fading into the background of his thoughts, replaced by the more immediate concerns of drying off and warming himself by his own study's fire, before finally seeking his bed. He pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped into the entrance hall, where a single sleepy footman rose from his post to take his soaked cloak. "Has the household retired?" Julian asked, handing over the dripping garment. "Yes, Your Grace, mostly. Mrs. Margaret is still about, seeing to a few final matters." Julian nodded absently, already moving toward the stairs that led up to his private chambers, his mind still occupied with thoughts of the shipping contract and the figures he intended to review before sleep finally claimed him. He climbed the first few steps before a small, nagging thought finally surfaced in his mind, faint but persistent, like a splinter he had not noticed until his hand brushed against it. He paused on the staircase, one hand resting on the polished banister, and glanced back toward the entrance hall, toward the doors that led out to the terrace where he had left his wife standing hours earlier. The footman, noticing his hesitation, spoke up carefully. Julian did not answer immediately. He stood there a moment longer, some old, buried instinct stirring uneasily in his chest, before he finally shook his head and continued up the stairs toward his chambers, telling himself that Evelina had certainly been let inside hours ago, that no one in his household would have been foolish enough to leave her out in such a storm for the entire evening. He was nearly to the top of the staircase when the memory returned to him with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. His own words, spoken in anger, specific and unmistakable. "Stand outside until you learn what it means to hold your tongue." He had not specified a length of time, had not given any instruction for her release, had simply walked away assuming the lesson would resolve itself through the natural passage of the evening. A cold feeling, entirely separate from the chill of the storm outside, began to creep through his chest. He turned on the stairs and made his way back down, his pace quickening with each step, though he told himself it was merely to confirm what he already assumed to be true, that his wife was safely inside, warm and dry, learning nothing more dangerous than a lesson in careful speech. He crossed the entrance hall and made his way through the darkened corridors, toward the side door that led out to the terrace, the same door Margaret had used hours earlier, his footsteps echoing against the stone floors in the otherwise silent house. As he approached, he could hear the storm still raging outside, the wind howling against the old windows with a force that made the glass rattle in its frames. His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, some part of him still reluctant to confirm the growing dread building in his chest, before he finally pushed it open and stepped out into the rain. Earlier that same evening, while Julian sat in Lord Whitmore's warm study discussing shipping figures, the servants of Ashcombe Manor had been caught in a quiet, tense debate that none of them dared speak aloud in full voice. In the kitchen, the cook, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Ida, stirred a pot of soup that no one would eat that night, her movements sharp and agitated. Beside her, the young footman Peter sat on a stool near the fire, still shaken from his earlier errand, fetching the blanket for Margaret. "It isn't right," Ida muttered, not for the first time that evening. "A woman standing out in weather like this. I don't care whose orders it was." "Keep your voice down," warned an older maid named Clara, glancing nervously toward the door, as though the Duke himself might materialize from the storm, to punish them for their whispered concerns. "You know what happened to that stable boy who spoke out of turn last winter?" "This is different," Ida snapped back. "That boy stole from the pantry. This is the Duchess, standing in a storm because she made a comment about silk prices. There's no comparing the two." Peter shifted uncomfortably on his stool. Mrs. Margaret already brought her a blanket and broth. She said the Dowager Duchess gave her word that any blame would fall on her, not on the staff. This piece of information seemed to ease some of the tension in the kitchen, though Clara still wrung her apron nervously between her hands. The old Duchess is a good woman, but even her protection only goes so far when the Duke's temper is involved. The conversation continued in fits and starts throughout the evening, servants passing information between one another in quiet corners and hallways, a network of concern spreading through the household even as none of them found the courage to directly defy the Duke's original command. Margaret's small acts of mercy, the blankets and broth, became a kind of quiet rebellion that the entire staff seemed to silently agree upon, even if none of them spoke the agreement aloud. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, the Dowager Duchess remained by her window for much of the evening, unable to fully settle despite having sent her message of protection through Dahlia. She thought often of her own younger years, of standing in a similar storm decades earlier, sent out by Julian's father for the crime of speaking too freely at a dinner party, about matters of politics she had been told were not a woman's concern. She remembered the way her own mother-in-law, the Duchess before her, had watched from a window much like this one and done nothing, had simply closed the curtains and returned to her needlework, as though nothing troubling were occurring just beyond the glass. She remembered the resentment that had built in her chest over that long, cold night, a resentment that had never fully faded even decades later, even after her husband's death, even after she had told herself countless times that such things were simply the way of noble households. She had sworn, somewhere in the depths of that old resentment, that she would not become the same silent, complicit figure her own mother-in-law had been. And so, tonight, she had done what small thing she could, offering her authority as a shield for the staff who wished to help, even knowing that her son's anger, when it eventually surfaced, would likely fall heaviest on her own shoulders for having interfered. As the evening wore on, Margaret returned to check on Evelina several more times, each visit brief but essential, providing what small comforts she could, without directly violating the Duke's original command. She brought a third blanket around midnight, noting with growing alarm the way Evelina's speech had begun to slur, the way her eyes had taken on a strange, glassy quality that Margaret recognized from her years of experience tending to villagers caught out in dangerous winter weather. "My lady, I must insist," Margaret said during this visit, her voice sharper than she had allowed herself to be earlier in the night. "This has gone on long enough. I care little for the Duke's anger at this point. Your life matters more than his pride." Evelina, wrapped in 3 heavy blankets that had done little to fully stop her shivering, managed a small, tired shake of her head. "Not yet, Margaret. I have come this far. I will not give in now." "This is not about giving in," Margaret argued, kneeling beside her, despite the cold stones soaking through her own skirts. "This is about surviving the night, my lady. There is no honor in illness, no victory in a fever that might take days or weeks to break, if it breaks at all." Evelina's eyes, though glassy, held a stubborn light that refused to fully dim. "If I go inside now, hidden away through some servant's door, then this will have been for nothing. He will believe his methods work. He will do this again, to me or to someone else. Believing it changes behavior, rather than simply causing harm. I need him to see the full cost of what he has done, Margaret. I need him to understand it in a way he cannot simply explain away or forget by morning. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, torn between admiration for the young woman's resolve and fear for what that resolve might cost her. Finally, she rose slowly, her old joints protesting the movement, and nodded with reluctant respect. "Then I will stay as close as I am able, my lady, and pray that this proves worth the price you may pay for it." She left again, this time to fetch dry cloths and to check whether the household's physician, an elderly man named Dr. Edmund Price who lived in the nearby village, might be quietly summoned, without alerting the wider household to the severity of the situation. She found young Peter still awake in the kitchen and sent him out into the storm on horseback, instructing him to fetch the doctor under the pretense of a minor household matter, not wanting to alarm the village with talk of the Duchess's true condition. Peter set off into the rain without complaint, understanding the urgency in Margaret's voice, even without her fully explaining the situation, and disappeared down the dark, muddy road toward the village, his horse's hooves splashing through puddles that had grown deep enough to soak through his boots within the first few minutes of the journey. Back on the terrace, Evelina remained standing, though her body had begun to sway more noticeably now, small involuntary movements that she fought to control through sheer determination alone. Her mind drifted in and out of clarity, memories and half-formed thoughts blending together in ways that felt increasingly difficult to separate from the present moment. She thought she heard her mother's voice at one point, calling her in from the rain the way she used to when Evelina was a small child playing too long in the garden during summer storms. She thought she heard her father's laugh, warm and booming, though she knew both of these things were impossible, memories surfacing from some deep, protected corner of her mind that the cold seemed to be slowly unlocking. The rain continued to fall, unrelenting, the wind occasionally gusting hard enough to nearly knock her off balance entirely, and still she stood, wrapped in blankets that had grown heavy and sodden with water, her body trembling in a rhythm that had become almost constant, a low, deep shiver that seemed to originate from somewhere far more essential than simply her skin. Somewhere across the county, unaware of the growing severity of the situation back at his own home, Julian continued his negotiations with Lord Whitmore, discussing profit margins and delivery timelines, with the calm, measured focus of a man entirely confident that the small matter of his wife's punishment had already resolved itself hours earlier, exactly as he had intended. The door swung open under Julian's hand, and the storm hit him full in the face, rain driving sideways in the wind, cold enough to steal the breath from his lungs for a brief, startled moment. He stepped out onto the terrace, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for some sign that he had simply imagined the worry building in his chest, some proof that Evelina had long since been allowed back inside. Instead, he saw her. She stood against the far wall, exactly where he had left her hours earlier, though she barely resembled the composed, elegant woman who had greeted his guests at the start of the evening. Heavy, soaked blankets hung from her shoulders, dragging down with the weight of absorbed rainwater. Her dark hair clung to her face and neck in wet ropes, and her skin, in the dim light spilling from the doorway behind him, had taken on a pale, almost gray quality that sent a genuine spike of fear through his chest. Evelina. Her name came out of him rougher than he intended, half question, half plea, and for a terrible, drawn-out moment, she did not respond at all. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, her eyes fixed on some point beyond him, unfocused and distant. He crossed the terrace in 3 quick strides, his boots splashing through puddles that had gathered across the stone surface, and reached her just as her knees finally buckled, her body beginning to crumple toward the wet ground. He caught her before she fell, his arms wrapping around her shoulders, and the moment he felt how cold she truly was, how deep and constant her shivering had become, the full weight of what he had done crashed into him, with a force that nearly buckled his own knees. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on his face, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, slurred and weak in a way that frightened him more than any shout or accusation could have. "You came back," she murmured, her words slow and unsteady. "I told them I would stand. I told them I would not go inside through hidden doors." "You should never have had to make that choice," Julian said, his own voice cracking in a way he had not heard from himself in years. Not since he was a very young boy, before he had learned to bury such things beneath careful composure. I am so sorry. I did not think. I did not consider. He stopped himself, understanding that apologies could wait, that right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her warm, getting her help, undoing whatever damage the hours of exposure had already caused. He scooped her up into his arms, the soaked blankets sliding away, and carried her toward the door, shouting for the house to wake as he moved. Margaret, someone, wake the house. Fetch dry linens. Fetch every blanket in this house. Someone bring warm water, now. His voice, sharp with a fear he had rarely allowed himself to feel, echoed through the darkened corridors, and within moments, the household began to stir, candles flaring to life one by one, as servants emerged from their quarters, in various states of undress, drawn by the urgency in their master's voice. Margaret appeared first, having barely settled into her own bed after her final check on Evelina, her face going white as she took in the sight of Julian, carrying his wife's limp, shivering form through the entrance hall. Your Grace, I sent for the doctor hours ago. Peter should be arriving with him any moment. Julian's head snapped toward her, something between relief and confusion crossing his features. You sent for the doctor? Without my knowledge? Forgive me, Your Grace, but yes, I could not stand by and watch her condition worsen without taking some action. The Dowager Duchess gave her permission for whatever measures were necessary. Julian did not respond to this immediately, too focused on carrying Evelina up the main staircase, toward their private chambers. But something in Margaret's words settled into him uncomfortably, a recognition that his own household, the people meant to follow his authority, without question, had felt compelled to act against his explicit orders, out of simple human concern for his wife's survival. He laid Evelina gently on their bed, and within moments the room filled with activity, maids arriving with dry linens and warm water, a fire being hastily built in the hearth despite the late hour, Margaret directing the household staff with the calm efficiency of someone who had clearly handled emergencies before, even if none quite like this. We need to remove these wet garments, Your Grace, Margaret said firmly, already reaching for the ties of Evelina's soaked dress. The wet fabric against her skin will only worsen the chill. Julian stepped back, allowing Margaret and two other maids to work, watching helplessly as they peeled away the ruined silk dress and wrapped Evelina in warm, dry blankets fresh from the airing cupboard. Her lips had taken on a faint blue tinge that made his stomach twist with a fear he had never experienced before, not even in moments of genuine danger during his younger years of travel and adventure. Her breathing is shallow, Margaret murmured, pressing a hand gently against Evelina's forehead, and her skin is far too cold. We need that doctor to arrive quickly. As if summoned by her words, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels reached them from outside, and moments later, Peter burst into the room, soaked through from his ride, followed closely by an elderly man carrying a worn leather bag, his coat dripping onto the polished floor. Dr. Price, Margaret said with visible relief. Thank goodness you came quickly. The doctor moved to the bedside without wasted motion, setting down his bag, and immediately checking Evelina's pulse, her breathing, the temperature of her skin, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had treated many such cases of severe cold exposure throughout his long years of village practice. How long was she out in the storm? He asked, not looking up from his examination. Julian hesitated, the question landing like a physical blow. Several hours. I am not entirely certain how many. Dr. Price's expression tightened slightly, though he did not comment further, instead, continuing his examination with quiet, focused concentration. Her body temperature has dropped significantly. This is a serious case, Your Grace. We must warm her slowly and carefully. Too rapid a change could shock her system further. He issued a series of instructions to Margaret and the assembled staff, warm water bottles wrapped in cloth to be placed at her sides rather than pressed directly against her skin, warm broth to be prepared for when she regained enough awareness to swallow safely. The fire kept steady but not overwhelming. Julian stood at the edge of the room throughout this process, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his entire life, watching as servants moved efficiently around his wife's still form, following instructions he himself had no knowledge of, no ability to provide. He had always considered himself a man in control, a man whose authority governed every aspect of his household, and yet here, in this moment that mattered more than any business negotiation or social obligation, he found himself utterly powerless, dependent entirely on the knowledge and skill of others. "Will she recover, doctor?" he asked finally, unable to keep the question contained any longer. Dr. Price glanced up at him, his expression carefully neutral in the way of experienced physicians who had learned not to offer false comfort. "The next several hours will tell us much, Your Grace. Her body has endured a severe shock. If we can stabilize her temperature, and she shows no signs of fever by morning, her chances improve considerably. But I will not lie to you and say the danger has passed. Exposure of this length, in weather this severe, carries real risk." Julian nodded slowly, the words settling into his chest with a weight he had never experienced before, not even in his darkest moments of professional failure or family disappointment. He moved to the bedside, taking Evelina's cold hand in his own, feeling the faint, weak pulse still beating beneath her skin, and for the first time since his father's death years earlier, he felt something that might have been genuine, unguarded fear. Behind him, in the doorway, the Dowager Duchess had appeared, drawn from her own chambers by the commotion, her aged face pale, with a grief that seemed to stretch back further than just this single night. She watched her son kneeling at his wife's bedside, watched the raw fear in his expression, and felt something complicated shift within her own chest. An old, buried hope that perhaps this terrible night might yet become the beginning of something better, rather than simply another repetition of the cycle she herself had suffered through decades earlier. The first gray light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the bedchamber, though Julian had not moved from his position beside the bed throughout the entire night. He sat in a hard wooden chair that Margaret had brought for him, his hand still wrapped around Evelina's, watching every small rise and fall of her chest, with an intensity that had left his own eyes burning with exhaustion. Dr. Price had stayed through most of the night as well, checking her temperature and pulse at regular intervals, adjusting the warm water bottles at her sides, murmuring quiet instructions to the maids who rotated through the room in shifts. Around 3 in the morning, Evelina's shivering had finally begun to lessen, a development the doctor had noted with cautious relief rather than full confidence. "Her body is beginning to recover its own warmth," he had said then, checking her pulse once more. "This is a good sign, but we are not yet free of danger. Fever often follows severe cold exposure, and that fever can prove just as dangerous as the cold itself." Julian had absorbed this information with the same grim, focused attention he might have given to a difficult business negotiation, except that this negotiation involved no contracts, no figures, nothing he could control through careful planning or firm authority. He could only wait, and watching, and hope that whatever strength Evelina possessed would prove enough to see her through. As the first light of morning strengthened, Evelina's eyelids fluttered, and a soft, pained sound escaped her lips. Julian leaned forward immediately, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "Evelina, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, before gradually finding his face. "Julian?" "Yes, I am here. You are safe now, inside, warm." She seemed to process this information slowly, her gaze drifting around the room, taking in the fire crackling in the hearth, the warm blankets covering her, the gray morning light beyond the windows. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night. Since I found you." His voice caught slightly on the words, a rare crack in his usually composed manner. "Evelina, I am so sorry. I should never have left you out there. I did not think about how long it would be before I returned. I did not consider—" "You did not consider many things," she said, her voice weak, but carrying an unmistakable edge that even her exhausted state could not fully soften. "That has always been the trouble, Julian. You act, and you assume the consequences will simply resolve themselves, without ever pausing to think about what those consequences might cost the people around you." Julian absorbed this with a wince, understanding that even in her weakened state, Evelina was not offering him easy forgiveness, was not simply grateful to be alive and warm, without also holding him accountable for the reason she had nearly not survived the night at all. "You are right," he said quietly, after a long moment. "I have spent this entire night thinking of little else. I do not know how to undo what happened, Evelina, but I intend to try, in whatever way you will allow." She studied his face for a long moment, her expression difficult to read beneath the exhaustion and lingering weakness, before finally closing her eyes again, too tired to continue the conversation any further. "We will speak more when I have strength for it, Julian. For now, I simply wish to rest." He nodded, though she could not see the gesture with her eyes closed, and settled back into his chair, still holding her hand, watching as her breathing evened out into something resembling proper sleep, rather than the fitful, shivering rest of the earlier hours. Dr. Price returned an hour later to check on his patient, and after a careful examination, offered his first genuinely optimistic assessment of the night. Her fever has not risen, and her pulse has strengthened considerably. I believe the worst of the immediate danger has passed, Your Grace. She will need rest, warmth, and careful attention over the coming days, but I have good reason to believe she will make a full recovery. The relief that flooded through Julian at these words nearly buckled him where he sat, a physical sensation of released tension that left him momentarily unable to speak. He thanked the doctor with genuine, heartfelt gratitude, arranging for him to stay at the manor for the remainder of the day to monitor Evelina's continued progress. As the morning wore on, word of the previous night's events had begun to spread quietly through the household, and beyond it, into the wider circle of servants and tenants connected to the estate. Margaret, exhausted from her own sleepless night of quiet defiance and careful care, found herself summoned to Julian's study shortly after breakfast, uncertain what reception awaited her there. She entered to find him standing by the window, his own exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, though his posture remained as controlled and upright as ever. "Your Grace," she said carefully, bracing herself for whatever consequence might follow her defiance of his explicit orders the night before. "Margaret." He turned to face her, and for a long moment said nothing at all, studying her with an expression she could not fully interpret. "I understand you sent for the doctor without my knowledge. I understand you provided blankets and warm broth throughout the night, against my explicit instructions." "Yes, Your Grace." She kept her voice steady, refusing to shrink from the admission, even as her heart pounded with uncertainty about what might follow. "I owe you my wife's life," Julian said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to struggle to fully express. "Had you followed my orders precisely, without exception, I do not know that she would have survived the night." Margaret's shoulders, which had been braced for reprimand, relaxed slightly at these words, though she remained cautious, uncertain whether relief was truly warranted. "I acted out of concern for her well-being, Your Grace. I could not in good conscience do otherwise. I know." Julian moved back to his desk, running a tired hand through his hair. "And I am grateful for it, even as I am ashamed that such defiance was necessary in the first place. You will not be punished for your actions last night, Margaret. Quite the opposite. I intend to see that your loyalty and good judgment are properly recognized." Margaret inclined her head slightly, still processing this unexpected turn, before venturing a question she had been carrying since the previous evening. "And the rest of the staff, Your Grace?" "Peter fetched the doctor at my instruction, and others assisted in small ways throughout the night. All of them acted with more wisdom than I did last night," Julian said quietly. "None of them will face any consequence for it." As Margaret left the study, a strange, cautious sense of hope settled over the household staff, as word of this exchange spread quietly among them throughout the day. It was not forgiveness for what had happened, not entirely, but it represented something the household had rarely witnessed from their Duke before, an acknowledgement of fault, however difficult it clearly was for him to voice. In the West Wing, the Dowager Duchess received similar word of her son's changed demeanor, and though she remained cautiously guarded in her own hope, having witnessed too many false promises of change throughout her own difficult marriage, she found herself allowing a small, careful flicker of optimism to take root, watching to see whether her son's apparent remorse would translate into any lasting change, or simply fade with time, the way such remorse so often did, in men raised to believe that authority excused all manner of cruelty. Despite Dr. Price's optimistic assessment on that first morning, Evelina's recovery did not proceed as smoothly as anyone had hoped. By the following evening, a fever had begun to build steadily beneath her skin, her cheeks flushing with heat, even as she complained of feeling cold, her sleep growing restless and broken by murmured, half-formed words that made little sense to those attending her. Julian barely left her bedside during those difficult days that followed, delegating his usual estate business to his steward, with instructions that he was not to be disturbed, except for matters of true emergency. He sat through long hours, watching Margaret and the other maids change cool cloths against Evelina's fevered forehead, watching Dr. Price return day after day to check her condition, with an expression that grew increasingly serious as the fever refused to break. The body sometimes takes time to fully process such a shock, the doctor explained during one visit, though his tone carried less certainty than it had on that first morning. We must simply continue to keep her comfortable, keep her hydrated, and wait to see which direction her condition takes. During the fevered nights that followed, Evelina spoke often in her sleep, fragments of memory and emotion surfacing, without the careful control she maintained during her waking hours. Julian, sitting beside her through these long, difficult nights, found himself learning things about his wife that 6 months of marriage had never revealed to him. "Papa, don't go," she murmured one night, her hand twitching against the blankets, as though reaching for someone only she could see. "I can help with the shop, I promise. I can count the coins properly." Julian listened, quiet and still, piecing together fragments of a childhood he had never thought to ask her about. He learned through these fevered mutterings that her father had died when she was young, that she had spent years afterward trying to prove herself capable and useful to a mother who had been forced to shoulder the full burden of their family's survival alone. "I only wanted to help," she whispered another night, tears leaking from beneath her closed eyelids, even as she remained lost in whatever memory or dream had claimed her. "I did not know about the silk losses. I did not know. Please believe me. I did not mean to embarrass you." This particular utterance struck Julian with a force that left him unable to breathe properly for several long moments. He realized, with a growing sense of shame, that even in her fevered, unconscious state, Evelina's mind remained troubled by his anger toward her, by the fear of having disappointed him, rather than by any anger of her own toward the punishment he had inflicted. He began to understand, slowly and painfully, the full weight of what he had built between them over these past 6 months. Not through any single dramatic action, but through a steady accumulation of small corrections and cold silences that had taught Evelina to fear his disapproval more than she valued her own sense of fairness or justice. During one particularly difficult night, when her fever seemed to spike higher than it had at any previous point, Julian found himself speaking aloud to her, though she showed no sign of conscious awareness, the words spilling out of him with a rawness he had rarely allowed himself in his adult life. "I do not know how to be different than my father was," he confessed quietly, holding her hot, restless hand in both of his own. "He taught me that authority required distance, that kindness was a weakness, that servants and wives alike would exploit given the chance. I have spent my whole life believing this, Evelina, and I am only now beginning to understand how much damage that belief has caused, both to you and, I suspect, to my own mother before you." He paused, watching her fevered face for any sign of response, though none came. "I do not deserve your forgiveness for what happened, but I find that I want it desperately regardless, more than I have wanted anything in longer than I can remember." The Dowager Duchess visited frequently during this period as well, sitting with Julian for stretches of time, as they both watched over Evelina's uncertain recovery. During one such visit, as they sat together in the dim, firelit room, she finally spoke of her own experiences with a candor she had never before shared with her son. "Your father once left me standing outside for nearly as long, when you were still just a small boy," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on Evelina's restless form, rather than on Julian's face, as though it were easier to speak such truths without direct eye contact. "I never told you, because I believed, for many years, that such treatment was simply the price of being a duchess, the necessary cost of maintaining proper order within a great household." Julian stared at her, stunned by this revelation, memories of his own childhood shifting and rearranging themselves in his mind, as this new information settled into place. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I did not wish for you to think less of your father," she said simply, "and because, for many years, I convinced myself that it did not matter, that the marriage endured despite such moments, and that endurance itself was a kind of success. I understand now, watching you these past days, how mistaken I was in that belief." She reached over and took Julian's hand, an unusual gesture of affection between them, one they had rarely shared even in his childhood. "I am grateful, Julian, to see you sitting here as you are, tending to her with such genuine care. Your father never once sat beside me during any illness or difficulty throughout our entire marriage. Whatever comes of this, know that you have already shown more capacity for change than he ever did." Julian absorbed these words in silence, feeling the full weight of generations of quiet suffering within his own family settling onto his shoulders, a legacy of cold authority and unquestioned cruelty that he now understood he had nearly perpetuated, without ever truly examining where such behavior had originated or what damage it continued to cause. On the 5th night of her illness, Evelina's fever finally began to break, her skin cooling gradually beneath the damp cloths that Margaret applied with steady, practiced hands. Dr. Price, called immediately upon this change, examined her with careful attention before finally offering the reassurance that Julian had been desperately awaiting for days. "The fever has broken, Your Grace. Her breathing has strengthened, her pulse is steady. I believe we have passed through the most dangerous portion of her recovery." Julian felt a relief so profound that his legs nearly gave way beneath him, and he sank into the chair beside her bed, watching her sleep. Truly sleep now, rather than the restless, fevered unconsciousness of previous nights, her breathing slow, and even for the first time since the storm. He remained beside her through the remainder of that night, no longer burdened by the sharp, immediate fear of losing her entirely, but carrying instead a different kind of weight, an awareness of everything he had learned about himself, his family, and the woman he had married during these long, difficult days of waiting and watching. He understood now that whatever came next, whatever conversation awaited them once Evelina had fully recovered her strength, he could not simply return to the patterns of behavior that had brought them to this crisis in the first place. Something fundamental had shifted within him during these past days, and he found himself both frightened and strangely hopeful about what that shift might mean for the remainder of their marriage. A full week passed before Evelina felt strong enough to sit up properly in bed and take solid food without assistance, and during that week of slow, careful recovery, the household around her seemed to transform in small but noticeable ways. Julian visited her chambers multiple times each day, no longer treating such visits as mere obligation, but seeking genuine conversation, asking questions about her health, her comfort, her thoughts, in a manner far more attentive than anything she had experienced during the earlier months of their marriage. One afternoon, as pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows of her chambers, Evelina finally felt strong enough to raise the question that had been building in her mind throughout her long recovery. "Julian," she said, setting aside the light broth Margaret had brought for her midday meal, "I want to understand something. Why did my comment about silk prices provoke such anger in you? I have turned it over in my mind many times these past days, and I still cannot fully understand what I did that seemed to warrant such punishment." Julian, seated in the chair beside her bed, where he had spent so many hours during her illness, was quiet for a long moment before answering. Lord Whitmore lost a significant fortune in a failed silk venture 2 years ago. It nearly ruined his family's finances entirely, and the loss was, in part, connected to poor advice my own father had given him at the time. I have spent 2 years trying to repair that damaged relationship, trying to convince him to trust my judgment again on this new shipping venture. When you mentioned silk prices, I feared you had unknowingly reopened a wound I had worked hard to heal, and worse, that it might reflect poorly on my own family's reputation for sound business counsel. Evelina absorbed this explanation slowly, understanding for the first time the specific context behind Julian's reaction, though this understanding did little to excuse the severity of his response. "You could have simply told me this, Julian, quietly, later, in private. You could have explained the situation and asked me to be more careful with such topics in the future. Instead, you humiliated me in front of your guests, and then left me to stand in a storm as though I were a disobedient child rather than your wife." "I know," Julian said, his voice heavy with the same shame that had been building within him throughout the past week. "I have thought of little else these past days. My father would have handled such a situation exactly as I did, without hesitation, without ever questioning whether such methods were fair or effective. I believed, without ever truly examining the belief, that harsh correction was the only way to ensure lessons were properly learned." "And has it worked?" Evelina asked, her voice quiet, but carrying a sharp edge of genuine inquiry rather than simple accusation. "Has such treatment ever actually taught anyone anything beyond fear?" Julian considered this question with more genuine reflection than he had given to almost anything in his adult life. "My mother told me, during your illness, that my father once left her standing outside for nearly as long as I left you. I never knew this before. She endured 40 years of marriage to him, and I always believed that endurance meant success, meant that his methods, however harsh, ultimately produced a stable household. I am only now beginning to understand that endurance and happiness are not the same thing at all, and that what I witnessed growing up was not a model of successful marriage but simply a woman who had learned to survive within a difficult and unfair situation. Evelina studied his face carefully, noting the genuine struggle evident in his expression. The effort it clearly cost him to examine beliefs he had carried unquestioned throughout his entire life.
Why did you never ask about my own family, Julian? About my father's death? About the years my mother spent building her business alone?
You have been married to me for 6 months, and yet you learned more about my childhood through my fevered ramblings this past week than through any conversation we have shared. This question seemed to land with particular force, and Julian was quiet for a long moment before answering. I do not know how to explain this without sounding as though I am making excuses for my own failures. I was raised to believe that a wife's history mattered less than her ability to properly manage a household and represent the family well in society. I never thought to ask about your father, your childhood, the specific pressures that shaped who you became, because I was never taught that such things mattered to the practical business of marriage. They matter a great deal, Evelina said firmly, though not unkindly. I spent my childhood watching my mother work herself to exhaustion after my father's death, determined to build something secure for us, despite having no formal training in trade or business. I learned from her that speaking plainly, saying what needed to be said regardless of social convention, was simply how one survived and succeeded in difficult circumstances. When I mentioned silk prices at your dinner, I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I was simply speaking as I had always been taught to speak, honestly and directly, without the elaborate social calculations that seem to govern every conversation among the nobility. Julian nodded slowly, understanding now the full context behind the misstep that had triggered such a severe consequence, recognizing that Evelina's directness, the very quality he had punished her for that night, was rooted in her upbringing, just as his own harsh authority was rooted in his. I want to understand you properly, Evelina, he said finally, reaching for her hand with a tentative gesture that felt different from his usual controlled composure. Not simply as a duchess who must learn proper behavior, but as the woman you actually are, with your own history, and your own reasons for thinking and speaking as you do. Evelina allowed him to hold her hand, though her expression remained thoughtful, rather than immediately trusting. That would require more than simply asking questions during a week of illness, Julian. It would require you to actually listen to the answers, and to change your own behavior based on what you learn, rather than simply filing the information away, while continuing as you have always continued. I understand, Julian said, and something in his tone carried enough conviction that Evelina found herself willing, cautiously, to believe him, even as she remained aware of how easily such promises could fade once the immediate crisis had passed and normal life resumed its familiar patterns. Over the following days, as her strength continued to return, Evelina and Julian spent long hours in conversation, covering topics they had never before discussed throughout their entire marriage. She told him about her father's laugh, about the way he used to carry her through the market stalls calling out prices in his booming voice. She told him about her mother's hands, rough and capable, counting coins by candlelight, about the fierce, protective love that had driven her mother to build an entire fortune from nothing, rather than allow her daughters to suffer the same uncertain poverty that had followed her husband's death. In turn, Julian spoke, haltingly at first and then with increasing openness, about his own childhood, about a father who had never once offered praise without also offering criticism, about a household where affection had always seemed conditional on proper behavior and flawless performance of duty. He spoke of watching his mother endure decades of cold treatment with a silence he had once mistaken for contentment, understanding only now how much pain had likely hidden beneath that careful, practiced composure. These conversations, difficult and sometimes painful for both of them, began to build something between Julian and Evelina that had not existed during the earlier months of their marriage, a foundation of genuine understanding rather than simple contractual obligation. Neither of them believed, even as this understanding grew, that the damage of that terrible night in the storm could be fully undone through conversation alone. But both of them recognized that something important had begun to shift, a crack of light appearing in patterns of behavior that had seemed, until now, as fixed and unchangeable as the stone walls of Ashcombe Manor itself. 3 weeks after the storm, Evelina had regained enough strength to walk through the manor's gardens for the first time since her illness, though she still moved slowly, careful of the lingering weakness that had settled into her limbs during her long recovery. Julian walked beside her, matching his pace to hers, neither of them speaking much as they moved along the gravel paths between rows of late autumn roses. It was during this walk that Evelina finally raised the matter she had been building toward throughout the weeks of her recovery. A conversation she had known would eventually need to happen but had delayed until she felt strong enough, both physically and emotionally, to face it properly. "Julian, I have been thinking a great deal about what kind of marriage I am willing to continue living within," she said, stopping beside a stone bench and lowering herself onto it carefully. "The conversations we have shared these past weeks have meant a great deal to me. I believe you have been sincere in your reflection, and I believe you genuinely regret what happened that night. But sincerity, and regret alone, are not enough to build a marriage I can commit to fully." Julian sat beside her, his expression serious and attentive, understanding that whatever she said next would likely shape the remainder of their lives together. "Tell me what you need, Evelina. I will not pretend to know the answer without hearing it directly from you. I need to know that you see me as your equal partner, not simply as a wife whose behavior must be corrected when it displeases you," she said, her voice steady, despite the difficulty of the words. "I need to know that when I speak plainly, when I offer opinions on business matters or social situations, you will treat such moments as contributions to a partnership, rather than as mistakes requiring punishment. I need you to consult me on decisions that affect our household and our future, rather than simply informing me of decisions after they have already been made." Julian listened without interrupting, absorbing each point with the same careful attention he might have given to a significant business proposal, understanding that this conversation carried far greater weight than any negotiation he had ever conducted with Lord Whitmore or any other associate. "I also need," Evelina continued, "for you to examine, honestly and continuously, the patterns you learned from your father, not simply once, during a crisis, but as an ongoing practice throughout our marriage. I do not believe old patterns disappear simply because we recognize them during a difficult week. I believe they must be actively resisted, again and again, until new patterns become genuinely natural rather than effortful." "That is a fair assessment," Julian admitted. "I have already noticed, these past weeks, moments where my old instincts rise up, moments where I feel the urge to correct you sharply or to dismiss your opinions in favor of my own judgment. I have been trying to catch these instincts before acting on them, but I will not pretend the effort comes easily, or that I will never fail at it entirely." "I do not expect perfection," Evelina said. "I expect honest effort, and I expect you to accept correction from me in turn, when I notice you slipping back into old patterns. That is what partnership means, Julian. Not one person holding all the authority, while the other simply endures whatever treatment comes their way, but both people holding each other accountable, in both directions." Julian nodded slowly, understanding the fairness of this request, even as he recognized how foreign such a dynamic felt, compared to everything he had witnessed and absorbed throughout his upbringing. "Though I suspect it will require more adjustment from me than you might currently anticipate." "Good," she said, something almost like a small smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. "Because I intend to hold you to it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after this exchange, watching late autumn leaves drift down from the trees surrounding the garden, before Evelina spoke again, this time raising a matter that had been troubling her throughout her recovery. "I also want to address the way the household staff behaved that night," she said. "Margaret defied your orders to bring me blankets and broth. Peter rode out into the storm to fetch the doctor without your knowledge. Your own mother offered her protection to the staff for actions taken against your explicit command. I want to understand how you feel about this, because it reveals something important about the household you have built." Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering this carefully. "I have thought about this a great deal as well. My first instinct, in the days immediately following your recovery, was to feel a kind of wounded pride, that my own household would so readily defy me. But the more I have considered it, the more I understand that their defiance reflected something important, that they recognized cruelty when they witnessed it, and chose compassion over blind obedience, even at risk to themselves." "That is exactly right," Evelina said, "and I believe it reveals something you should take great care to preserve, Julian. A household where servants feel compelled to secretly defy cruel orders is not, in the end, a truly well-run household, whatever appearance of order it might present on the surface. I would rather build a household where such defiance is never necessary in the first place, where kindness and fairness are simply the standard practice, rather than something achieved only through quiet rebellion against unjust authority. Julian absorbed this observation with genuine consideration, understanding the wisdom behind it even as it challenged assumptions about proper household management that he had carried throughout his entire life. I will speak with Margaret, and with the rest of the staff, about the kind of household I wish to build going forward. I want them to feel that speaking honestly, even in disagreement with my decisions, is welcomed, rather than something requiring the kind of quiet, fearful defiance they demonstrated that night. As their conversation continued, they discussed practical matters as well, ways in which Julian might begin including Evelina more genuinely in estate business, opportunities for her to apply the practical knowledge she had absorbed from her mother's successful trading business to the management of their own household finances. Julian found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely interested in her perspective on these matters, recognizing skills and knowledge in her that his own upbringing had never taught him to value or seek out in a wife. By the time they finally rose from the garden bench and made their way back toward the manor, the late afternoon light beginning to fade toward evening, something had settled between them that felt more solid and genuine than anything that had existed during the earlier months of their marriage. Neither of them believed the road ahead would be entirely smooth, that old patterns would simply vanish without continued effort and occasional setbacks. But both of them walked back toward the manor with a shared sense of purpose that had not existed before the storm, a foundation built not on blind authority and silent endurance, but on honest conversation and mutual accountability. Behind them, unnoticed, the Dowager Duchess watched from her window in the West Wing, observing her son and his wife walking together in quiet, apparently genuine conversation, and allowed herself, for the first time in many years, to believe that perhaps this next generation of her family might finally break free from patterns that had caused so much silent suffering throughout her own long life within these walls. 6 months after the storm that had nearly cost Evelina her life, Ashcombe Manor had transformed in ways that extended far beyond the physical repairs made to the terrace stones that winter's harsh weather had cracked and worn. The household staff moved through their daily duties with a visible ease that had not existed before, no longer burdened by the constant, quiet fear of provoking their master's cold anger over small, forgivable mistakes. Julian had kept his word to Margaret, gathering the entire household staff shortly after Evelina's full recovery, to formally acknowledge the courage they had shown that difficult night, and to establish new expectations for how the household would operate going forward. He had spoken plainly, without the careful distance he had once maintained between himself and those who served him, expressing genuine gratitude for their willingness to prioritize compassion over blind obedience, even at personal risk. "I have learned," he had told them that day, standing before the assembled staff in the great hall, "that a household built on fear produces only the appearance of order, while true loyalty and good judgment flourish only where kindness and fairness are genuinely practiced. I ask that each of you continue to speak honestly with me, even when such honesty might be uncomfortable, because I have come to understand that such honesty serves this family far better than silent, fearful compliance ever could." The staff had received this speech with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope, understanding that words alone could not undo years of established behavior, but recognizing in Julian's tone and manner a genuine shift that continued to prove itself through his daily actions in the months that followed. Evelina, for her part, had gradually taken on a more active role in managing the estate's finances, applying the practical business knowledge she had absorbed from her mother's years of successful trading to identify inefficiencies in the estate's management that had gone unnoticed for years. Julian, rather than feeling threatened by her competence in matters he had once considered exclusively his own domain, found himself genuinely grateful for her insight, recognizing improvements to their financial standing that his own more traditional approach to estate management had never achieved. Their conversations, too, had continued to deepen throughout these months, both of them making genuine effort to catch old patterns before they could take root again. There had been occasional missteps, moments where Julian's old instinct toward sharp correction rose up in response to some minor disagreement, and Evelina had learned to call attention to these moments directly, without hesitation, rather than allowing old patterns of silent endurance to re-establish themselves. "You are doing it again," she had said on more than one occasion, during disagreements over household matters or social obligations, and each time, Julian had paused, considered her words seriously, and adjusted his approach, understanding that this ongoing vigilance was precisely the kind of effort their partnership required. Lord Whitmore, too, had noticed the change in the Ashcombe household during subsequent business dealings with Julian, commenting once, during a visit to discuss the continued progress of their shipping venture, on how genuinely engaged Evelina seemed in matters of trade and finance. "Your Duchess has a sharper mind for business than half the lords I have dealt with in my career," he remarked one afternoon, watching as Evelina discussed shipping timelines with the same confident directness that had once triggered such disastrous consequences. "You are fortunate to have married a woman of such genuine capability, Ashcombe." Julian had accepted this observation with quiet pride, no longer feeling the old anxiety that had once made him fear Evelina's plain speaking as a potential embarrassment, understanding instead that her directness represented genuine strength rather than a flaw requiring correction. The Dowager Duchess, too, had noticed the changes taking root within the household, and had begun, in small ways, to open up more fully to her son and his wife about her own experiences throughout her long marriage to Julian's late father. These conversations, difficult though they sometimes were, had brought a new closeness to the family that had not existed during Julian's childhood, a willingness to speak honestly about past pain rather than burying it beneath careful, practiced silence. On the anniversary of the storm, nearly a full year after that terrible night, Julian arranged a quiet dinner for himself and Evelina alone, wanting to mark the occasion not with celebration exactly, but with acknowledgement of how far they had traveled together since that difficult beginning. "I think of that night often," he admitted, as they sat together in the same dining room where the original offense had occurred, though the atmosphere between them now carried none of the tension that had once characterized their formal dinners. "I think of how close I came to losing you, entirely through my own thoughtless cruelty. I do not believe I will ever fully forgive myself for what I nearly cost us both." "I think of it too," Evelina said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But I have come to believe that the storm, terrible as it was, became the beginning of something better between us, rather than simply an ending. We might never have had these conversations, might never have built this genuine partnership, if that night had not forced us both to confront patterns we had never properly examined before." "Do you regret standing outside as long as you did?" Julian asked, a question that had lingered in his mind throughout the months since her recovery. "You could have accepted Nora's offer, slipped inside quietly, avoided the worst of what followed." Evelina considered this question seriously before answering. "I do not regret it, though I recognize now how dangerously close it came to costing me my life entirely. I needed you to understand, in a way that could not simply be dismissed or forgotten by morning, the true weight of what such cruelty costs. I believe, had I simply slipped inside quietly that night, we would never have arrived at the understanding we now share. Sometimes the hardest lessons require the greatest cost to properly take root." Julian nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words even as he continued to carry genuine regret for having created a situation that required such a painful lesson in the first place. "I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you survived to teach me that lesson, and that you chose to remain in this marriage, despite every reason you might have had to walk away from it entirely." "I chose to remain," Evelina said, "because I saw, in the days and weeks that followed that storm, genuine capacity for change within you. Had I seen only empty apology, without real effort behind it, I would have made very different choices about our future together. But you showed me, through consistent action rather than simple words, that you were willing to examine and change patterns that had seemed, until that point, as fixed and permanent as the stones of this house itself." Outside, beyond the tall windows of the dining room, rain had begun to fall softly against the glass, a gentle autumn shower, quite different from the violent storm of a year earlier. Julian glanced toward the window briefly, an old flicker of guilt passing across his features at the sight of rain against glass, before Evelina's hand tightened gently around his own, drawing his attention back to her steady, warm gaze. "The rain no longer needs to frighten either of us," she said softly. "It can simply be rain now, nothing more." Julian smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that would have seemed impossible to imagine on his face a year earlier. Before the storm had forced them both toward a reckoning neither had fully anticipated. Thanks to you, Evelina. Thanks entirely to your strength that night, and your patience in the months that followed. Together, they finished their quiet dinner, as the gentle rain continued outside, no longer a symbol of punishment and cruelty, but simply a reminder of how far they had traveled together since that terrible night, and of the genuine partnership they had built from its difficult beginning, a foundation strong enough now to weather whatever storms, literal or otherwise, might yet come their way in the years ahead.